Hello and welcome to Lecture 7, where we'll be discussing growth and its effect on trade. This is from Chapter 7 in your book. Um, and this chapter focuses on changes in productive capabilities. So if a country has some change that changes their ability to produce, these production side changes are usually called economic growth. Um, Although we will consider cases where there's economic decline. There are two fundamental sources of long-run economic growth. The first is increases in countries' endowment of production factors. So physical capital, labor, land, something changes or increases that. Maybe there's a lot of immigration that occurs, so they have a lot more labor. The second one are improvements in production technologies. So these might make it so that they're more effective in their production process and are able to produce more. So these growths affect how countries will trade internationally. So that's what we're going to discuss today. The first concept we'll look at is balanced versus biased growth. So growth in a country's production capabilities shifts the country's production possibility curve outward. As the PPC, production possibility curve, shifts out, we're interested in knowing the effects on the general shape of the production possibility curve and the specific production quantities for the different products if product prices remain the same. So production possibility curves, if it shifts out and proportionately the products have the same share of production in the country, we'd call that balanced. However, if one product has an outsized growth, we call this bias growth. It's biased towards a particular product. You will see here three different graphs. We're looking at figure 7.1 in the book. The first 7.1a shows balanced growth. So the growth is exactly proportional between cloth and wheat. And so we start with our production along the production possibility curve right here at S1. Here's our consumption at C1. You can see we're producing 80 of wheat and 20 of cloth. When this production possibility curve shifts outward because of growth, you can see now we've got here at S2 is where we produce. And so we see an increase in wheat production from 80 to 112 and an increase in cloth production from 20 to 28. So that is proportionate. And you can see that the willingness to trade shifts outward as well. And so we've got at C2 the amount of consumption. So this is the amount that would need to be produced outside of the country. When we look at B here, we see a growth bias towards cloth production. Okay, so we see in the production possibility curve increase more for cloth than for wheat. We start here with our production at S1 before the shift and end up at S3. You can see there's no increase in production of wheat, only an increase in production of cloth from 20 to 40. And while there are still some imports at our because of our consumption at C3, we're less willing to import because of this production possibility curve shifting outward. You can see that it's almost close to this production possibility. And when we look at C, which is a growth bias towards wheat production, you can see a lot more growth in wheat production, a lot less in cloth production. So here's our production possibility curve. We started at S1, and because of this shift, we're now at S4. You can see our production of wheat jumps from 80 to 130, but our cloth does not move. So we do not see a shift in production or an increase in production in cloth. Again, we see a good jump here from C1 to C4, which means that we're still willing to trade and import a significant amount based on the consumption. So in balanced growth, the country's production possibility curve shifts out proportionally so that its relative shape is the same. And we can see that here. The relative shape is the same from the initial production possibility curve to the new production possibility curve. In biased growth, however, the expansion favors proportionally more of one of the products, so that the PPC will be skewed toward the faster growing product. And we saw that again with both of these, skewed towards cloth or skewed towards wheat, depending on that. So what if we see growth in only one factor? We're going to introduce the Rybczynski theorem. And in a two-good world, which is what we're looking at with our example between wheat and cloth, in a two-good world, and assuming that product prices are constant, so we don't see increase or decrease in the price of these products, just an increase in the potential production of each product or the production possibility. Growth in the country's endowment of one factor of production with the other factor unchanged has two results: an increase in the output of the good that uses the growing factor intensively, and a decrease in the output of the other good. So what we're saying is, I mean, as we look back at our example with wheat and with cloth, wheat has the factor that it intensively uses of land, whereas cloth, it intensively uses labor. And so if there is a change in one of those production factors, an increase of land, then we would see or expect an increase in the output of wheat, which uses the growing factor intensively. On the other hand, if we see a whole bunch of immigrants coming in and we have an increase in our production factors of labor, we might expect that cloth might be the one that would grow. Let's take a quick look at the Rybczynski theorem by looking at this graph. In this single factor growth example, let's assume that we have an increase in labor. And so that increase in that factor, the input of labor, we would expect affect the production of a product that is more labor intensive. And so we can see that. We can see it increasing the production possibility curve for cloth, but not really increasing much for wheat. We can see we start, we're producing 80 of wheat and 20 of cloth at point S1. With the shift of the production possibility curve, we can see it shift out to S5, and we are now producing 35 of cloth. Now, we do know that cloth does require some land, and so that land would be taken from wheat production and repurposed for cloth production. So we can see a decrease from 80 to 74 at point S5 in the production of wheat. Now let's discuss the changes in the country's willingness to trade. So production and consumption change with growth. A country's willingness to or interest in engaging in international trade can also change. It can increase willingness to trade, so export and import more, or it can decrease the willingness to trade. They would export and import less. So we looked at that before in figure 7.1, where we saw a decrease in the willingness to trade as a result of the shift of the production possibility curve. resulting from changes in or growth in production factors. So changes in a country's willingness to trade can also alter the country's terms of trade, um, depending on the country's size. So let's look first at a small country case. If the country is small, i.e. a price taker in the world trade, then its trade has no impact on the international price ratio. For large countries, if a country is large, a change in willingness to trade affects the equilibrium international price ratio. This change could either improve the country's terms of trade or deteriorate the terms of trade for that country. So let's look at growth bias towards replacing imports in a large country. A reduction of a large country's demand for imports reduces the relative price of import goods. This change is an improvement in the country's terms of trade. So we can see it reduces the relative price of import goods. The country gains from growth for two reasons. The production benefit from growth shifts the production possibility curve out, so that is a gain. Also, they get a better price for its exports relative to the price paid for imports. So this figure 7.3 in your book, shows the growth bias toward replacing imports in a large country. So you can see we've got our original production possibility curve with production at point S1, 80 for wheat and 20 for cloth. Because of an increase in labor, we can see the production possibility curve shifts outward, but shifts more for cloth than it does for wheat. What we end up with is a production point of 7 or S6 with an increase in wheat production of 91 and an increase in cloth production of 26.7. How does this affect our consumption? So you can see consumption lies right here at C1 before the shift. So we're consuming 40 in wheat locally and 60 in cloth. After the shift, we can see it, the consumption is now at C6, where we have 54 of wheat being consumed and 82 of cloth being consumed. So a large country can gain, as I mentioned before, in two ways from expanding ability to produce the import competing good. Here we're talking about cloth. In addition to the gains from being able to produce more cloth, it can improve its terms of trade. So what does this mean? So by demanding fewer imports, we call this a decreased willingness to trade. So they don't need as many imports. They're demanding fewer imports. It makes cloth cheaper on the world market. So after growth, the relative price of cloth declines from 1 wheat per cloth to 2/3 wheat per cloth in this example. So the country's remaining imports cost less. So they're still importing some, but they cost less because of lesser demand out there on the world stage. Thus, the country gains more from growth as consumption shifts from C1 to C6 because the price line becomes flatter. So in the previous examples, these were parallel. The price lines were parallel, but in this case, we see it getting flatter at C6. And so this gives us this 2/3 wheat for cloth. So growth that increases a large country's willingness to trade. So the increase in the country's demand for imports increases the relative price of the import good, or the increase in the country's supply of exports reduces the relative price of the export good. So this change in the equilibrium international price ratio is a deterioration in the country's terms of trade. The overall effect on the country's well-being is not clear. So we saw in the previous slide that a decrease in the demand for inputs, for imports, and so that affected the world price. In this, we're saying an increase in the country's demand for imports will increase. So this is on the other side, the relative price of the import good will increase. So this change, as I mentioned, the overall effect on the country's well-being is not clear. Now let's talk about immiserizing growth. Growth that expands the country's willingness to trade can result in such a large decline in the country's terms of trade that the country is actually worse off, as opposed to better off in our previous example. So there are three crucial conditions in immiserizing growth. Number one, the country's growth must be strongly biased toward expanding the country's supply of exports, increasing its willingness to trade. And the increase in export supply must be large enough to have a noticeable impact on the world prices. The foreign demand for the country's exports must be price inelastic, so that an expansion of the country's export supply leads to a large drop in the international price of the export product. Before the growth, the country must be heavily engaged in trade so that the welfare loss from the decline in terms of trade is great enough to offset the gains from being able to produce more. So in our positive example, where it was a good thing for the country, their production factor of labor was what increased. So it allowed the country to make more cloth. What if the growth was actually in land? Somehow there's more land and they're able to produce more wheat. This export of wheat, having more supply of exports, will affect the price, the international price of the export. And so that might harm the US more than the gain from being able to produce more, having more land. So here's the graph showing immiserizing growth in a large country. We've got our original production possibility curve, producing at point S1. Here we've got our new production possibility curve, where we're able to produce a lot more wheat. You can see we're producing at point S7. And so we're able to produce more wheat and more cloth. But let's look at consumption. So our price before was 1 wheat per cloth. But now it's going to cost us 3 wheat per cloth because of the drop in the price of wheat, because we're now producing more and exporting more. So you can see this price curve is becoming more vertical, which brings consumption to point C7. And so we can see here we have a negative effect on consumption, and it is not good for the country that this happens to. Next concept is technology and trade. Another basis for comparative advantage can arise over time as technological changes occur at different rates in different sectors and countries. So in some ways, technology-based explanation is an alternative that competes with the HO model, the Heckscher-Ohlin model that we talked about before. In other ways, technology differences can be consistent with an HO view of the world. So one effort to find a pattern in these technology activities is the product cycle hypothesis, which we'll talk about this, and it has to do with individual products and the product cycle. And this, according to the product cycle hypothesis, which was first advanced by Raymond Vernon, when a product is first invented, the major demand is mostly in high-income countries, and the product still must be perfected by using additional R&D and local production. Over time, however, the product and its production technology become more standardized and familiar. intensity in production tends to shift away from skilled labor toward less skilled labor. So the technology diffuses and production locations shift into other countries, eventually into developing countries with abundant, less skilled workers. So we can see this with a lot of technology, whether it be the CD player, now smartphones, production may have first started in America, but now those skills or the technology has been diffused to other countries, and there are now different production locations. Openness to trade also affects growth. Openness to international trade can enhance the technology that a country can use by facilitating the diffusion of foreign-based technology into the country and by accelerating the domestic development of the technology. The growth rate for the country and world as a whole increases in the long run when we see this technology diffusing internationally. With that, we've covered some of the main points from chapter 7. Again, I highly recommend you read the chapter to dive a little bit deeper. If you've got specific questions, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I have my regular office hours. If those hours don't work for you, please shoot me an email and we can schedule another time. Thank you very much.